How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobbit Time. I did a Google search for the most famous things that spin, and incredibly, Gandalf the Grey was not on the list. But we know better. Gandalf spinning on the floor of Orthanc is one of the most iconic and important spinning things from the whole Fellowship of the Ring. And today, that's what I'm going to be recreating. The first thing I needed to start working on this diorama was a motor and a metal tube that will fit over the shaft of the motor without too much effort. Oh man, I could have sworn this was the right size. The tube will be essential for getting some nice torque evenly distributed all the way to Gandalf's feet. I tested the motor just to make sure everything was working, and it was. I trimmed the tube down more than I needed to get it to a more reasonable length, and then I added a smaller tube to make up for the larger piece that I had just cut off. For Saruman's Palantir room, I'll be using this hexagonal box which had a picture hanger on the back, which needed to be removed, and I chose this box because it's tall enough to hold the motor. The next step was to mark the center of the box and drill a hole. Along with the obvious center hole for all the moving parts, this motor has 6 holes for mounting screws, and in order to drill them correctly, I needed to make a jig from a piece of clear acrylic. That way I can transfer the correct hole pattern to any surface that needs it. Now that I know how much space I have to work with, I could trim down the second tube to the length of Gandalf. This will be his full length from head to toe. The next step was to create the rest of the armature, starting with the arms, and I did not print out a size reference from the photo because the risk of ruining the scale elevates the stakes, which makes things more exciting. After the arms, I used a second wire to give Gandalf his right leg, and the skeleton of the armature was done. The next step was to throw him into a clamp and use some foil to give him some muscle. In the process of bulking him up, the only thing I feel like I did not get right was the size of his head. I didn't account for the huge pipe that was in there and the thickness of the clay on top, but I was able to hide most of the volume with hair and beard, so I feel like it turned out decently in the end. After the foil, I tested the fit to make sure everything was looking good, which it was, and the next step was to add some clay, which I sliced off and threw through the clay roller and began grafting onto the body. Once Gandalf was mostly covered in a base layer of clay, I began adding the finer details and then began sculpting the face and the hair. And the dream that exceeded my skill level was to achieve an accurate Ian McKellen, but as I began the process, I decided that I'd be happy with whatever passable Gandalf face that I could muster. Sculpting with clay has not historically been my thing, and I'm far more comfortable with digital sculpting, but I get a lot of comments that say 3D sculpting and printing are ruining the hobby. I do disagree with that, and hopefully people will see this Gandalf and recognize that maybe some people should be 3D printing. I found some ultralight Sculpey at the store, which I had never seen before, and I thought, hey, I might as well try that to keep the weight down on his clothing. And maybe I did not read the instructions, but it did not work for me, so I opted to use something else. And that something else was just standard gray Super Sculpey, and it's honestly not all that heavy, and because the structure is being built around that pipe, like I mentioned earlier, weight actually wasn't all that big of a deal. Off camera, I blasted the hair and face with a heat gun to keep those in position while I worked on the clothing. After the belt and boots were in place, it was time to sculpt the hands, which I chickened out of and decided to not choose the way of pain, but instead use some leftover hands from an action figure that were the perfect scale. I added some cuffs and some trim around the bottom of the robe, and this gray wizard was done. I then cleaned up my workstation and baked Gandalf off camera, obviously, for 20 minutes, and then I glued his hands in place. And with that, the construction of Gandalf was done, and he was ready to be spun on his head right round, and it was time to get back to the base. I decided to prepare the floor on a separate piece of acrylic rather than attempt to do it directly on the wood. This was for a few reasons, the first being that the floor of Orthanc is a dark rock with lots of little cracks and veins, which you can see me hand gesturing here. And that would have been difficult to carve into the wood. I used a scribing tool to carve those lines in, which look like some form of Elvish. It's a secret only a different camera angle can tell. For the black obsidian-ish look of the floor, I decided to experiment with this hammered black spray paint, and the one downside of the texture that came with the paint was that I lost all of my lines. The good thing was that after it dried, I was able to find them and score them again. I left that to fully dry, and then in the morning I came back and flooded all of the lines with a light gray panel liner from Tamiya. The process of which is very satisfying, if you could see it. The panel liner is super subtle, but I'm really happy with how it looks. The next step was to move back to the lower part of the base and figure out the positioning of the electronics. I marked out and drilled a hole for the potentiometer, which I will be fitting with a slightly longer dial knob than it comes with. It's recessed a little bit into the hole, but it sticks out far enough to still be able to use. I drilled a small hole on the opposite wall as the potentiometer for the power cord. With the holes drilled, I was able to take the base outside and give it the same coat of hammered black as the floor piece. I then set that aside to dry, and it was time to paint Gandalf. And while I do that, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I started with a black primer from the airbrush, followed by base colors for Gandalf's skin and his bluish gray robes that he has before the Balrog. After the base coats, it was a matter of adding the midtones, which included some dust on his robes because Gandalf's very old and I'm not sure how often he actually washes his robes or gets new ones. From there, I began building up the highlights using a brush, and it may not be a masterclass paint job by any stretch of the imagination, but it does make up for my lack of sculpting skills. It's also a diorama about Gandalf spinning around in circles on his head, so I'm not too concerned about perfection. After Gandalf was done, I brought back the base, which was now fully dry, and it was time to start thinking about assembly. I bought a bunch of little M3 screws, the heads of which are the same height as the acrylic, but the holes that I drilled in the acrylic were a little too small, unfortunately, so in order to make those sit flush, I had to go back and widen them with the drill, which made them a little bit more messy, but at least now they fit. The only thing now that was bothering me was that the silver screws were quite obvious and unsightly, so after gluing the acrylic in place, I masked off the shaft of the motor, and then I took the whole thing outside and gave it another coat of hammered black. That did mean I had to redo the panel liner to bring back the marbled look on the floor, but that was not a big deal at all. With the motor installed and the dance floor done, it was time to get everything wired up. I ran the wires from my power supply through that little hole that I had drilled earlier, connected that to the potentiometer, and then connected that to the motor. With everything soldered and sealed away, there was only one thing left to do. And that was to stick the metal rod into the giant hole in the side of Gandalf's head. After that, I called it good.
But you have elected the way of pain!
Earlier this week, I hit 1 million subscribers, which is absolutely crazy to me. Thank you all so much for watching and enjoying my content. I'll have a 1 million subscriber special coming soon, as well as some other fun announcements for 2025. Stay tuned for that. Otherwise, that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.